Okay, thank you, Dan, for the technical support. Good morning, good afternoon, participants. Thank you for attending this webinar. Today we're going to be telling you about the activities on transboundary movements of plastic waste under the Basel Convention Plastic Waste Partnership. My name is Melissa Lim from the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions. So as I mentioned, we have a long list of speakers. So I will start off by a brief introduction on the Plastic Waste Partnerships and its activities, which will be followed by a presentation on our very specific activities to look at information on implementing the Basel Convention Plastic Waste Amendments by Ms. Patricia Whiting from Sims Recycling Solutions, who's one of the co-leads of this activity. Following that, we will hear from Hannah Woodridge from the UK Environment Agency on how the UK is implementing the amendments. And then we will have two presentations from industry representative, starting with Ms. Sophie Seacard from the European Plastics Recycling Branch of EURIC, who will be speaking about specification sheets that they are developing. And then from Ms. Adina Adler from ISRI, who will be speaking about the specifications that ISRI has developed. And last but not least, we will have an intervention from Cyril Rachet from Gaia, who will be speaking about their views on issues related to transposing the Basel Convention amendments. So without further ado, briefly about the Plastic Waste Partnership. It's a multi-stakeholder platform that was established by the Basel Convention Conference of the Parties in 2019 with the objective of mobilizing stakeholders, not just governments, but also industry and civil society, to find solutions to the recognized and growing problem of plastic waste pollution. So we currently have 110 member entities in this partnership, and it's still open. So whoever is online and who would like to join, just drop me an email. There's a process and we can get you on board. And you can find more information about the partnership and its activities on the webpage shown on this slide. The partnership is still quite young, and its work is currently undertaken in 4 project groups listed on this slide. Today, we will be focusing on the activities of Project Group 3 related to the transboundary movements of plastic waste. As you can see, these groups are co-chaired by a broad range of stakeholders from different types of organizations. And besides transboundary movements, they also tackle plastic waste prevention and minimization. There's one group looking at recycling and related mechanisms. And finally, there's a group working on outreach, education, and awareness raising. The impetus for establishing the Plastic Waste Partnership was the adoption of what we call the Plastic Waste Amendments, which are essentially amendments to the annexes of the Basel Convention to add or expand the scope of plastic waste. And these amendments were adopted with an objective of improving the control on the trade in plastic waste, which was perceived as contributing to this global problem of massive plastic pollution. So this third project group on transboundary movements of plastic waste has 4 activities it's tasked with four activities. And at this point, because it's still a new initiative, the activities are mostly focused on collection of information to set baseline, identify gaps, and then to see what further actions needed. So activity 2, on which you will hear more in the next presentation, is looking at information on actions taken by countries to implement the amendments. Activity 3 is looking at best practices on enforcement, and this activity is led by the World Customs Organization and should be starting shortly. And the 4th activity will be looking at collecting data on transboundary movements of plastic waste, challenges in collecting such information, and how and what type of new technologies could assist in that regard. And all these activities collected should hopefully feed into the first one, which is centered around building capacity for implementing the amendments. I'd like also to mention that the partnership has a program on pilot projects, and it's the first round of activity under this program has just been completed. We received a total of 188 proposals, and there were 23 that were selected for implementation. 6 of these proposals are related to the activities undertaken under Project Group 3, and they'll take place in Asia. So if you want to find out more and maybe submit a proposal in the next round of pilot projects, then please consult the website shown on this slide. So that was just a very, very brief introduction. As I said, there's further information on the web page. And if you have any question, just drop me an email. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce the next presenter, Ms. Patricia Whiting from Sims Recycling Solutions, who will be presenting on the call for information on the implementation of the plastic waste amendments. Patricia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Melissa. Can you hear me?
Quite well, thank you.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Good morning and afternoon and evening. I'm very happy to be here. So as Melissa said, I'm going to discuss the work under Project Group 2 under the Transboundary Movement Group. So to begin, just getting my bearings here. Let's see. So in terms of the activities, I'm focusing on the second one, which, as Melissa noted, we're collecting information on actions taken by countries to implement the amendments, in particular on their interpretation and challenges experienced in preparing for implementation. It is our hope that the information that's gleaned under this activity will feed into other activities under the Transboundary Movement Group, including capacity building to help countries implement the amendment, sorry. So as a refresher, in terms of the plastic waste amendments, one major change, of course, was that they added the new entry, the parties, Y48, which includes mixtures of such waste. But when you look down, excluding the Annex 8 and 9 waste. So in terms of Annex 2, this is special waste requiring consideration. And it's very similar to Annex 8, both require prior informed consent, both are hazardous. The only difference, my understanding, is that Annex 8 it would subject shipments to the ban amendment, whereas I don't believe that Annex 2 does. In particular, also with Annex 9, the parties did not come to an agreement in terms of some of the terms, in particular, almost free from contamination or waste containing only one polymer. And so because of that, there's been a lack of legal clarity. And the hopes of this exercise is that by collecting information, it will assist the competent authorities and customs with implementing the amendments and also with the regulated community with complying with them. So I apologize. I don't usually wear headsets, so it's hard to hear myself talk. So in terms of the next slide, if I can get there, let's see. Okay. So basically, I just went through this, that there is like these terms, almost free from contamination, almost exclusively, that need to be better defined. And we believe, I mean, it's clear that international and national specifications can offer point of reference as we further define these terms. So this segues into the next slide. So essentially, a subgroup was established to compile this data, and I co-chair it with my colleague Augustin from Argentina, and it's very straightforward. We're compiling information in support of implementation that would include specifications related to almost free from contamination and other types of waste, and almost exclusively for shipments of plastic waste destined for recycling, as well as compilation of information on actions taken to implement the amendments, including information regarding any adopted measures and challenges experienced in preparing for implementation. So we're hopeful that the outputs of this will further, again, feed into the work, the later subsequent work that the group will do in capacity building and other activities to assist with competent authorities and the regulated community. So next. So with regard to the first output, information on national and international specifications, a call was made to the partnership members, and the information so far that's been collected is available at that site. And it includes examples of approaches by several governments, including Japan, Switzerland, and the UK, as well as examples of specifications provided by URIC and ISRI. And later today, some of these, there'll be presentations on some of these approaches. So in terms of output 2, a questionnaire was sent to the parties. Sorry, I'm just losing my place. On very straightforward questions, basically trying to determine awareness of the specifications and how they are implemented, and measures and actions taken to implement the amendments, including the types and challenges encountered and what could be helpful to address them. There were 2 versions of the questionnaires, one dedicated to the parties and one focused on the stakeholders. So as a preview of what the results were so far, essentially we've received 36 responses by the parties, and 27 indicated that they're not aware or do not use specifications to implement the amendments, and 9 responded that yes, they do. So if you look at that small profile, we have some work to do here. So in terms of those that answered no, 7 respondents actually have, they're using methods and approaches to, implying them in implementation, in preparing for implementation. And 16 answered no, and 4 didn't answer. So I guess we have the 7 to guide us in terms of they're using something to help them with applying the plastic waste amendments. So in terms of next steps, we've extended the deadline to February 2021 because it was, the holidays kind of came in between when they were circulated in late December. And the parties and stakeholders are invited to provide inputs. Still, we're looking for some guidance. And the information will be considered at the second meeting of the Plastic Partnership Group in April 2021. And finally, we invite you to please complete the questionnaire if you haven't, and we'd like you to kindly join the partnership, and in particular, Project Group 3 would love to have your participation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia, for this succinct presentation. I forgot to mention at the beginning of my presentation that we will have an opportunity for questions to all the presenters at the end of the series of presentation. So if you have any questions at this point, I would like to ask you to wait until then. Now, so we can now move on to the next presenter, who's Hannah from the Environment Agency of the United Kingdom. Hannah, the floor is yours. Thank you.
I wasn't muted on my phone, but then unfortunately it muted. Anyway, thank you very much. Sorry about that. Patricia has just covered the actual Basel amendments themselves, so I'm not going to obviously cover those again. I'm going to talk a little bit around the English interpretation of the requirements and their implementation. At this point, I do just want to make clear that this is not the UK position. This is the English position. Obviously, there are a number of devolved agencies regulating environmental law within the UK. So we've got Northern Ireland, Natural Resources Wales and SEPA, and I'm only talking on behalf of the Environment Agency today. Oh, there we go. Right, so implementation of the amendments. The UK government committed to implementing these amendments in full, and we did so via an amendment of the EU waste shipment regulations in December 2020. Now, that automatically then applied into English law via the EU exit arrangements. Due to the vast amount of legislation that was being dealt with due to EU exit, that wasn't encompassed until the end of December 2020, although we have had ongoing discussions within the industry since sort of autumn 2020. And as soon as these discussions were finalised, DEFRA leading with the Environment Agency and the other devolved administration, we've been providing detailed advice to industry on the requirements of the impacts. Now, clearly, it's been quite a rapid implementation of all these new requirements. We only had the actual wording of the legislation in December 2020. We have particularly focused on industries that are significantly impacted. So PVC industry in England have seen their movements covered by notifications now as Y48, and therefore all of their movements are now covered by the requirement for prior informed consent. So we spent quite a lot of time providing direct advice, webinars. DEFRA have led several, the Environment Agency have provided some as well, but particularly to the PVC industry. One of the other things that we did have to do is update our IT system so that it was able to accept Y48 applications for export. Our IT system only accepts export applications. We deal with import applications separately offline. So there was a lot of work that we had to do in quite short order to try and get all of that put into the IT system. And just to give you an idea of the sorts of volumes that we've been seeing is, to date we have received 21 applications for Y48 materials, mainly for PVC and polyurethane, 20 of those being exports, 1 for import, which happens to be from Belgium. We have, that number is substantially less than we were expecting. And the conversations that we have had from industry is that the vast majority of the plastic movements are believed to fall into the B3011 category of being single polymers, or that one allowed mix of PE, PP and PET. So let me change the slide. There we go. I've mentioned the fact that we have provided fairly comprehensive guidance. That has been through a number of iterations and is uploaded onto the Basel website as a part of our response to the questionnaire that Patricia referred to earlier, so that you can all see that. Our guidance is split into two parts. So one is the sort of the nuts and bolts of the implementation in terms of how we have interpreted those various different categories. And one thing that I do want to point out is I would definitely recommend people have a look at those responses that Patricia referred to, because there are a number of different interpretations of what is B3011, not just those terms that we're going to cover in a little while about almost exclusively that are not defined within the regulations. We also provided some really very detailed guidance about applications in terms of what had to be in those applications. Many of the operators have never had to deal with these notifications before of prior informed consent. And because of the timescales involved in this, we needed to make those applications as efficient as possible, and therefore we aim to make that guidance very detailed to make the applications acceptable first time round. High quality applications facilitate the quick turnaround, and that's helped us to support industry. There's work to do there. We have had a number of very similar issues across all of those 21 applications, so we will be looking to try and support our customers further in terms of more guidance. As I say, we've provided a number of open webinars for operators, and it's also helped us to deliver frequently asked questions for operators. And I think that capturing of those frequently asked questions will be really important, because that is how different countries are implementing these regulations and what are the expectations. Things that we've particularly noticed are where separated bales of different polymers are transported together. Clearly they will now be Y48. We have a number of customers who have indicated to us that presents problems to them because they would never hold an entire container full of one type of polymer. So that's causing them issues. We have noticed issues to do with fridge plastics, the mixture of ABS, polystyrene and olefins. If they're not separated, they'll obviously need to now go as Y48. If there are other additional materials outside of plastic, so if there's any metal or any of the other foam type scenario in there, then clearly that's unlisted. And it's not Y48. And one of the issues that we're having is the difference between an unlisted waste, a Y48 waste, and a Y46 waste. When does one become the other? Because there are no agreed percentages for that. Further on from that, we have supplied the information out via trade associations. We've had quite some widespread coverage, and they've been really key in helping us to support operators and get the messages out. So a big thanks to everybody who's actually supported those messages and as I say, for some industries that have been quite significantly impacted. I was just going to mention our enforcement approach. At this point in time, it is based on advice and guidance. We're working to bring operators into compliance. However, we are stopping a lot of loads leaving England because they are not B3011, but there's no notification in place, or they are just mixed waste. We have a number of issues with paperwork, and I've got some photographs of that, but it's just to let people know that we do not let loads leave. If there is an issue, we may not enforce, i.e. we may not prosecute, but we will stop those containers, and that's been the situation from day one. As I say, we've got some implementation concerns about B3011 and the other Basel changes. Is the difficulty in inspecting these wastes. I've got some further photographs on the next slide. we carry out most of our inspections at port prior to export. And as I say, many operators are exporting as B3011 single polymers. Well, we need to check all of these to make sure that they are actually single polymers. It's very difficult to identify the polymers within the loads. You can see here on the left is a typical mixed rigid plastic. Now, the suggestion is that this is the allowed mix, predominantly polypropylene, but we have to check these bales, and that's obviously very difficult on the sorts of scales of thousands of containers leaving. We've also got documentation issues. This is an excerpt of an Annex 7 post January the 1st. So we are finding companies still, using some of the old codes. We've stopped a number of B3010 loads, and also this particular one was, we just need to make sure that the documents actually reflect the waste inside. A couple more pictures for you. The bottom picture just shows you kind of what the inside of a truck looks like, and therefore it's exceptionally difficult for ports officers to actually pick out the different polymers. So on face value, the B3011 single polymer, it sounds very simple to be able to actually inspect it, but in reality it isn't. And that's one of the sort of concerns that we do have about the implementation. And the photograph just to the left, you will get these slides, so you should be able to see the photographs a little bit better. In the middle of that photograph, you can see a black piece of waste that appears to have the letters TRIC. That's electrical cable covering. That's PVC. And therefore, this load was actually stopped, not only because it contained PVC, which is now Y48, but also due to the POPs issue, the persistent organic pollutants issue, in that PVC cable covering can be POPs. And this particular exporter didn't have the appropriate paperwork to be able to show that. We've mentioned already the terms that are not defined within the legislation, almost exclusively, almost free of contamination. Effectively, that means that our current Environment Agency guidance still stands. So by GLW, I mean green list waste, i.e. Article 18 waste. But a green list waste may need prior informed consent or be banned or prohibited if it doesn't comply with these points. And you'll note that we do not apply a percentage to these. It is based on a de minimis level of contamination. I cannot put a figure on that, and I shall cover the reasons why on the next slide. So that is the current EA guidance for how we define the difference between a green list B3011 waste and what would be a Y48 mixed waste. In terms of why we won't apply those particular percentages, the EU waste shipment regulations require, and now the UK retained version of those regulations, require that green list waste must not be contaminated by other wastes. Those regulations do not supply a percentage, specify a percentage of acceptable contamination, but have explicitly stated that it should be de minimis. And that green list waste should not require sorting before it's further reprocessed. Because of the international nature of the movement of waste, if we state an acceptable percentage of a contamination level, no other country is legally bound by that. And therefore, it's very difficult to apply that. The regulations also state that if there's a dispute between the two competent authorities on the classification of waste, that the precautionary approach will always apply, and therefore the chances are where we don't necessarily agree, it will fall within either the Y48 category or the Y46 category. But as I mentioned before, it's actually quite difficult to define the difference between the two because it's what is the predominant material. You may have also seen that we recently had a successful case against Basel about the export of waste, and the judgment in the appeal of that suggested that if we did introduce a percentage contamination standard, it would likely be that the decision would be subject to a judicial review, because we've gone beyond our remit as a regulator, because the regulations don't state those percentages. And introducing that percentage would go against the primary objective of the waste shipment regs. It would also almost certainly be considered to be abuse of process. So there are a number of legal arguments against applying percentages. Further to that, different contaminants can cause problems at different levels. For example, very small quantities of waste glass will cause problems for perhaps recycling of a paper, whereas the light weight of plastics would mean that glass would be very contaminated at a 2% waste threshold. And therefore, it's very difficult to apply a blanket percentage of agreed contamination, because it absolutely depends on the waste that you're dealing with on a case-by-case basis, depending on where it's going. Therefore, there needs to be different thresholds for specific contaminants, and that's extremely difficult to police and to enforce in what is a global market, because each country will have their own local controls. Introducing a contamination threshold is going to cause practical problems for our ports inspections. You've seen from the photographs how difficult that can be. Currently, we examine the outsides of all the bales in a load and evidence 3. So generally, that's sort of somewhere around 10%, depending on how many bales are in the load. We can't possibly pick out all the items of contamination, and this process already takes about 6 hours per container. If a percentage contamination threshold were introduced, we'd need to evidence each and every bale, which would take at least 40 hours. This simply isn't practical. We'd then also have the risk of detaining them, with a concern that if the contents prove to be within the tolerance limit, the exporter may look to us as the regulator to pay for the cost of missing their shipment, bearing in mind the timescales involved. And these circumstances are likely to lead to officers being more risk averse in what they're stopping, and to allow containers with significantly more than the tolerance limit to continue their journey, and therefore this could lead to a higher in practice tolerance level. Our concern is that by applying a limit, this is likely to impact behaviour. It will be seen as a target. It's a bit like the speed limit. It's seen as a target rather than a limit. This is likely to drive behaviours in the wrong direction, in that it will result in all waste gravitating to that level of contamination or slightly above. So we have real concerns about the application of a limit for that reason. We've also seen, a number of competent authorities, Turkey in particular, recently, tightening their controls on unsuitable exports. We would be in an extremely difficult legal position and potentially liable for costs if the exports fell within the prescribed thresholds for us, but were then turned away overseas, as each country is responsible for its own interpretation. So we will continue to not apply a percentage of allowable contamination for the number of reasons that I've covered. Legally, it just doesn't stand up. Next steps for us is building on our experience in treating mixed polymers and contamination. Up until now, when plastics have been exported, clearly the contamination has been dirt, paper, metal, anything that wasn't plastic. Now contamination has moved to that, plus also other polymers of plastic. So therefore, it's another step up for how we identify and look at our inspections. We're looking, DEFRA has been leading on the work on ensuring that the UK is fully aware of the requirements under the Green List Waste regulations for B3011 to non-OECD countries. That work has been going on. We're looking to trial a piece of equipment. It looks a little bit like a hairdryer to test and identify different polymers where that would assist us in making sure that polymers are actually either single polymers or the allowed mix. We're spending a lot of time liaising with other competent authorities to make sure that we are totally clear on what they do and don't want and how that relates to the legislation and how we can enforce that. We're looking at updates to our guidance. I've mentioned that this is a real process of learning and learning from each other and best practice. So we're looking to update our guidance and obviously have an overview of the correspondence guidelines number 12 from the EU. But obviously, as we are a non-member state, we have an interest in them, but we will not be applying those correspondence guidelines. If we did apply anything, it would be on our own interpretation. And also, we're leading on the work with the Basel technical guidelines for plastic wastes. And finally, we've also been working with the Environmental Services Association on some export standards. That's a work that we've been liaising with them, and they are shortly due to publish those standards. So again, that may be an area to look at in the future. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the English interpretation of the regulations, how we're implementing them, and the issues that we've come up against to date. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for this very informative presentation outlining the issues and the difficulties in implementing the amendments. So I think some of the aspects that you raised about specifications may be then addressed by our next speaker, who is Ms. Sophie Sicard from URIC.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all participants. First, I'd like to thank the Plastic Waste Partnership Secretariat for giving us the opportunity to present our specification sheets. So I'm the Vice President of URIC Plastic Recycling Branch. So we are the European Recycling Industry Confederation. And this is the work we've been doing as an industry to clarify what we understand and what we can propose as a definition for the White 48 and B3011 codes, which also for Europe, which is our territory, I would say our reference territory, also applies to EU 48 and EU 3011 codes. So how did we work on those for developing this plastic waste specification sheet? Basically, as everyone, we started with the definition from the Basel Convention amendments, and we focused on those very important words, which are exclusively consisting of and free from contamination and mixtures. So from there, our method was to say, how can we address these changes and provide as clear as possible a definition and workable for the industry of what is White 48 and what is B3011. And so we needed to evidence how, with the current operational waste purity, we can propose and what is efficiently destined for material recycling in an environmentally sound manner, which is the key of the purpose of the UN Basel amendment. So we focused on reporting average values of recycling workable impurities. So what can we do? What can we accept as an industry as incoming streams, basically? So how did we work to develop them? First, as I said, we review the meaning of the words, and we prepare a generic format layout for typical plastic waste. The point was to list which kind of data, which kind of information you need as a recycler to find out if a waste is compliant or non-compliant. What will you look at to determine if a waste is compliant or not with a recycling process? Then we review what was already applied in other industry sectors, in particular cardboard, which is much more advanced than plastics in the standardization process. And then we implemented a review of existing and currently used plastic-based standards. In particular, in Europe, we focused on the EPR scheme standards, where, for example, CTO standard in France, or the Corepla standards in Italy, and the standards in Germany. Then we prepare a list of the most often exported qualities, and for the most exported qualities, we prepare a draft of possible specification to be used as reference within Basel, for the implementation of the Basel amendments. So we didn't propose one size fits all threshold for all type of waste, because it is a very simple reality of our industry that the streams are extremely diverse, and that there is no such thing as one standard recycling process. Each recycling process for plastic materials will change depending on the incoming stream and the origin of the waste. So this is why we have several specification sheets and not only one. So although this is not one size fits all, it's quite we developed quite a reduced number of specification sheets, and some of our colleagues actually thought there was not enough specification sheets. So why didn't we go for a very wide range, like dozens of specification sheets? For very basic reasons. First, because of time, we don't have time to develop dozens of spec sheets. Second, because there is presently no harmonized standard in Europe, and obviously in the world, not to say. So we needed to find common ground and to have like kind of simplified basis. And third, the standard architecture needed to remain simple enough to be understood and applied by custom officers, because this is key to us. It is very important for us as an industry that we have a common understanding with customs officers on what is allowed and what is not. So our standards, they are not meant to replace what is key today in the structure of our industry. Basically, they are not meant to replace contractual agreements. They are not meant to replace national quality standards, in particular the EPR schemes quality standards. And they are not meant to replace Europe-wide quality grades, which we want to develop as an industry. Our specification sheets are meant to be compatible with all this. So basically, this is how our specification sheets look like. So maybe this is a bit a big small, so I will enlarge it. We have a specification number, the name obviously, and a reference to the Basel Convention wording. Correspondence with sand quality grades, the polymer type, waste type, description of possible waste format. So, for example, would it be bottles? Would it be films, etc., etc. Transportation formats as well. For instance, is it generally bales or big bags? How does it look like, basically? And was it a prior treatment and that the waste have been has undergone? And then we arrive to the purity threshold, and there you will have the same structure basically for all the specification sheets. So you have the target material with a minimum percentage, and then different categories of contaminants, product-related contaminants, which are allowed, and non-product related contaminants, some of them being tolerated because the recycling process can deal with them, and some of them being absolutely prohibited because the recycling processes cannot deal with them. So, for instance, in this specific case, which would be the HDPE milk bottles, what is the cap, the label will be considered as product-related impurities and are not accounted as impurities. They are part of the object, of the targeted object, so they are not considered impurities. This is how, as an industry and within the EPR schemes, this is how currently we account for impurities. And what would be considered impurities would be other plastics objects, for example, I don't know, PP or PET bottles, for instance, flexible films, and what would be absolutely prohibited contaminants would be the PVC, obviously, and what is not considered as of the non-polymers material. For instance, paper, cardboard, magazines would have to be max 0.5, and organic waste should be limited to traces only. Okay, so this is our, so at the end of the day, so we have, this is exactly what I've just explained. At the end of the day, we have this this target material item, a product-related impurities, which is within this target material items, and the combined mass of all the impurities which are limited with this number below the 5% below. So we also develop a specification for flakes because there is a lot of diversity of waste within our industry, and this waste flakes which are generally sorted and washed is extremely diverse. So there we could not define a specific origin. This was just more to give a generic sense of what is acceptable for recyclers as a purity threshold. So there we have a 90% purity threshold for those flakes. I just have to mention here that the flake status is very blurred currently. In some countries, flakes are considered waste, and in some other countries, they are considered product or byproduct. So currently in EURIC, our position is that flakes that are fit for integration within a manufacturing process should be considered as non-waste. And for the others, those kind of specification sheets should apply. So here you have the list of the different specification sheets we developed. So as you can see, for packaging plastics, the proposed purity threshold vary from 85% for films, LDPE films from household packaging, to 95% for the other rigid items. And for technical plastics, the purity levels can vary also from 95 to as low as 65%. Once again, this is meant to fit the reality of our industry, which is there is no such thing as one plastic waste. There are several wastes and several origins. So small domestic appliances flakes will naturally have more metal than a polypropylene packaging will have. And the recycling facilities are meant and are designed to deal with those contamination, to extract them and to have them valorized. Well, this is all for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for explaining the perspective of your industry regarding what specifications could look like. So we now have as our next speaker Ms. Adina Adler, who's from ISRI, and who will also explain about existing specifications developed by her organization. And Adina, if I may ask, could you briefly give an overview of the membership of ISRI, so our participants can understand the differences maybe between EURIC and ISRI, if that's possible. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation. I will be speaking on the ISRI specifications, and as Melissa just requested, I'll start with a brief introduction of ISRI. We are the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries. We are a trade association that represents more than 1,300 member companies located in 41 countries around the world, although 80% of our membership is based in North America. And our members process all recyclable commodities that are listed there on the screen, the metals, paper, plastics, etc. And as our mission statement says, we promote safe, economically sustainable, and environmentally responsible recycling. And the scrap specifications are a key component of that mission. I would also like to say we also represent equipment manufacturers that make the heavy equipment that are used in recycling operations, but obviously that's not necessarily relevant for this presentation today. And we believe recycling is essential to the economy, to jobs, to manufacturing, but really most importantly, to the achievement of a circular economy. So the scrap specifications are internationally recognized guidelines that are used in the process of trading commodities. Commodities of, as I said, metals, plastics, paper, tire, and rubber, they are tradable commodities used in manufacturing, and they do move across borders according to the commercial market. And so the scrap specifications are used to aid in the negotiation for purchase and for selling of those commodities. But they do recognize, most importantly, that national regulations do apply. And I'll get into the specifics about the specifications in a minute. The commercial transactions, the buying and selling of commodities are market driven. And so these specifications have been written to reflect manufacturer demand, as well as what the supply capacity that is available to meet that manufacturer demand. We do see the specifications listed as a reference point in several, actually more than just what's listed on the screen, but we see it in US, India, and Australian regulations, and in some other places as well. And we do have specifications, as I said, for all of the commodities listed at the bottom of the screen. In fact, our scrap specification circular is more than 100 years old. The very first specification that was written was actually for textile goods, but it has evolved into all of the different commodities. And the URL is listed at the bottom. There's where you can access the full booklet of the specifications. One key note I'd like to mention is that we are undergoing a holistic review of the specifications to make sure that they are in line with the 21st century commodity markets, that they reflect changes in the international regulatory space, including with the Basel Convention. And so what I'm presenting to you today is still in use and is accessible, but it will change because we recognize the changes happening in the international marketplace. Really quickly, I'm not going to go through this slide, but what the point of this is that it's a living green document. The specifications may change as market conditions change. And anybody, whether a member of ISRI or not a member of ISRI, may come to us and request a new specification, a change, or maybe even a removal. And it goes through a fairly rigorous review process with public comment periods involved in there before those changes are adopted. And in recent years, we did have a couple of changes that are relevant to the plastics segment. We've had other changes in other commodities, but I didn't list those here, but relevant to plastics. A couple of years ago, we put in new specifications for material coming into material recovery facilities, making sure that they are a certain cleanliness, a certain separation, et cetera. And making sure that certain items are left out that would just be a contaminant. And we do have new specifications for PVC because PVC in certain applications is recyclable. Okay, so the plastics chapter of the specifications themselves are about 50 or 60 pages, but the plastics chapter starts on page 35. And it starts at the very beginning with some introductory paragraphs that apply to all of the specifications, all of the different types of plastics, all the different grades. So it provides general information and it provides definitions. And as I said, this is all under review. These guidelines may change. I don't know. That review is taking place among our members in the plastics segment, but they are taking a look again to make sure that the information that is presented is relevant for today's market. Now, in that introductory section is information on what is considered a contamination. And these paragraphs, as I said, apply to all the different types of plastics. So for example, unspecified materials cannot exceed 2% of the total bale weight. Unspecified means, and you will see just in a minute, the specified materials, things that may have a higher tolerance or low tolerance. But anything else not listed, there should not be too much of that. Prohibited material, so things like agricultural chemicals, hazardous materials, flammables, anything frankly listed in Annex 1 of the Basel Convention is never allowed, period. We recognize that those items would render those plastics as hazardous and thus should come under the controls of the Basel Convention, especially if they are listed as an Annex 8 hazardous plastics. Absolutely, we recognize that. We also recognize that there shouldn't be any liquids to the extent as possible. And we're talking free flowing. We're talking about if it's a beverage container that is half full of that original beverage, that should never be allowed. If you have little incidences of drops here and there, that is not harmful to recycling, and that is generally accepted. We just want to make sure that the bale is not sort of swimming in some sort of a liquid. And in general, the material should be free of dirt and mud and grease and all of those things that would absolutely make that material contaminated, highly contaminated, and possibly not recyclable. So again, this applies to all of the plastics. And then we have certain definitions. And again, this is just to help clarify that everybody is on the same page. The buyer, the seller, even the governments are on the same page in understanding what does material mean when it's baled? What does densification mean? What is a flake? And then we talk about what is a mixed load plastic, what is a bottle film, etc. Again, we recognize that some of these definitions may be a little bit outdated, and so these may be rewritten to reflect today's market, but this is what it's read. And again, it's just to make sure that buyers, sellers, and governments are on the same page, that we understand what it is that the material is referring to. Now, we have specifications for all of these types of plastics and all of these grades. And I'm going to share two examples just to walk through how to read the specifications. But I just want to present that we have all of these products have a spec. And again, these are under review, whether this list will be the same, whether we add new ones, maybe some will be taken away, some will be rewritten. We do recognize that there are mixtures. As you can see, there's mixed bulky rigids. There is a polyethylene retail mix film. Again, there are markets for this, and we do recognize that the Basel Convention must apply, but for right now, these are just written, as I said, as a guideline for buyer and seller. Okay, so let's start with one example, is the PET bottle. And again, I am just presenting this so that you understand how to read the specification. We have the title PET bottle. There is a description that tells you exactly what it is and how to identify it, the product, where does it come from. And then we get into what might be considered a contamination as specific to the PET bottle, something that might be, not a PET bottle, something that might render the ability to recycle PET bottles as difficult, etc. And so there are some examples here, but we go into greater detail. We have a chart here for PET bottle bale grades. And you can see there's a grade A, B, C, and F. And each of these grades have different tolerance levels for contamination. And I'm going to talk about this chart in a minute, but I do want to emphasize, again, there is a market, if you can believe it, for grade F. Now, it may have a lower price point. It may require, yes, it will require more separation, more recycling technology. And generally speaking, these markets are here within North America. They are not necessarily for the export market. Now, what would be considered a contamination just for the PET? Earlier, I talked about what is considered contamination for all plastics. But for PET, we get into more specifics. So total contaminants should not exceed the percentages by weight that are listed in the chart above. So HDPE, LDPE, polypropylene, aluminum, metal containers, all of these things are easily separable from the PET bottle bale. So if to explain, if I am the buyer, I'm bringing in a bale of PET bottles, and it's within the grade A. So I note that there may be up to 6% of LDPE, HDPE. I can separate those materials away from the from the PET bottles, and I can probably sell it to a recycler, maybe down the street or maybe in another community. But the point is I'm okay with receiving a bale that has this amount of material because I have the ability to separate it out and sell it to another recycler down the street. Now for PET bottles, as I said earlier, all hazardous constituents are never allowed. But I want to be more specific. So in the specification for PET bottle, specifically, there is zero tolerance for PVC, for chemicals, for wood, glass, rocks, stones, medical and hazardous waste, etc. So this is an opportunity to be more specific so that as traders of PET bottles, we both are on the same page in recognizing that these things are never allowed. Now, this chart, again, I said that I would make a specific comment about. There is a recognition, as I said, that there are markets for different grades and they are at different price points, et cetera. As part of the renovation or the rewriting of these specifications, our members are going to be eliminating this chart and instead writing separate specifications for the export market as there is for the domestic US market. And so we will see probably that grade A or something similar, and possibly with a lower contamination threshold that will be written, and it will include specific guidance that says that this material must comply with the Basel Convention's plastics amendments, and it must comply with national regulations of the destination market. And we'll put information in there about the prior informed consent procedure if it doesn't comply, et cetera. So I just want to recognize for everyone, don't be too concerned about the high percentages that you see listed here, because we do recognize there are going to be changes and there will be an opportunity to sell highly clean, separated plastics into the export market in compliance with B3011. But these other grades, B, C, and F, and they will probably be written and have a different title. There will still be a specification for that because there is a market, there is business here in North America that can comply with those specifications, but we'll recognize that they are not compliant with B3011 of the Basel Convention. And if there is a market outside of the United States, then these will comply with Y48 in Annex 2. As another example, I want to show that polypropylene small rigid plastics does not have that chart. So not every plastic specification is written in that way. Here you have polypropylene, which is ubiquitously used for food applications. And you note the contamination tolerance does not exceed 8% by weight of the things that are listed below. And then it gets a little confusing, I recognize. And again, we're going to rewrite it so that there isn't this confusion. But you see 2% maximum acceptable of metal and paper. That means out of the total 8%, 2% of that should not be more than 2% of metal and paper. But the remaining toleration can have a little bit of liquid. There can be HDPE included, PET, polystyrene, and none of that should exceed 8%. But again, and then on the right side, you see that the following contaminants are never allowed, and it's the same thing. There should never be plastic film. There shouldn't be wood, glass, or medical or hazardous waste in a bale of polypropylene, small rigid plastic. So that's just another example of a specification, but a chart was not necessary for this particular type. Anyway, I thank you for listening. I understand that this presentation will be shared around, but there is the link to the specifications if you want to look through it further. And my email address is on the screen. I'm happy to answer questions here or at a later time by email. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Adina, for the insights into the market for plastic waste, and also the nuances of reading these specifications, which I admit I myself had some trouble understanding. So that's very helpful. Our last speaker is Cyrine Rachel from Gaia. And Cyrine, I'm sorry, I'll have to ask you to be very brief because we are running against the clock, and I'd like to leave some time for questions and answers to all these great speakers. So floor is yours, Cyrine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will endeavor to be brief. And I'm grateful that there is at least some civil society environmental group representation. So thank you for this opportunity. I think your colleague was going to share my slides. Which I can't see yet, so I'll just wait. Excellent, thank you so much. Yes, so I'll skip straight to slide 2. There we go. So I'm going to focus on 2 points today to explain why, in our view, in the view of Gaia, we need clear and strong contamination limits for plastic waste in order to distinguish B3011 shipments from Y48. So in short, right now, environmentally sound recycling is a requirement for B3011 plastic waste shipments. However, we do not have guarantees to operationalize this requirement for environmentally sound management, environmentally sound recycling in particular. And then there is also no transparency for toxic emissions that arise from recycling operations, including wastewater from washing, the washing phase. In addition, there's no transparency for the mismanagement of residual plastics that arise from recycling operations. And I'd like to insist on that point a little bit, because for us, this is a key reason why we need strong contamination limits. So the more contaminants in a bale of recyclable plastic, so the more material which is not the specific plastic that was bought for recycling, the larger the volume of residual wastes. And if these residuals are mismanaged, the higher the potential for environmental harm and resulting harm to human health. And finally, we believe that having strong contamination limits is a really powerful incentive for improvements in collection of waste, separate collection in order to reduce contamination, but also relocalizing plastic waste management economies and a better and a true and genuine focus on prevention, not just in lip service, and redesign. We really believe that when the decisions for design are made very far away from where wastes are managed, it's very unlikely that the negative impact from the management will actually result in lessons learned for design. And next slide, please. So this is a little example from Ecuador, an investigation into the imports of plastic waste by Productos Paraíso. It's a little company in Ecuador which imports US plastic waste. It's polyethylene agricultural plastic, mostly from Mississippi. And this waste comes with a high contamination rate. It comes with approximately 50% of dirt. And so the importer pointed out to local investigators that he pays duties on that dirt. So it's prejudicial for him. And so because of that dirt and because of their recycling operation, there has to be significant washing. And it turns out that for the past 6 years, this company had been throwing out its wastewater into a local stream. The wastewater was black with chemicals, and it also included a lot of microplastics and plastic fragments, which you can see in this picture. So this is not one-off human error. This is sadly what happens when some recycling operations are externalized to a country which doesn't have the ability to enforce environmental regulation. Next slide, please. Next slide again. So the slide I just skipped was a video about the impacts in Turkey. I'll put the link in the chat so people can see it. This little infographic is a really clear summary of how toxics from the open burning of plastic waste, and especially residuals that come in those bales. So those plastic contaminants, when they are open burned, they create toxic pollution that concentrates in the food chain and ends up in our bodies. And I'd like to point you to the many investigations that IPEN has done on this issue, looking at different kinds of plastic waste, including e-waste, but not only, also packaging waste, and all the detail is there. Next slide, please. So I'd like to conclude by giving you an overview of our recommendations for implementing the Basel plastic waste amendment. Some of these relate to contamination, but not only. For us, the most important thing is to clearly ensure that relevant waste controls also apply to fuels, alternative fuels made from mixed plastics, so RDF, etc. And I think our colleague from the UK pointed out that for some actors, it can be difficult to draw the line between Y46 and Y48. In terms of contamination limits, we are recommending what is currently implemented by Hong Kong and was implemented by China before they banned imports. So that's 0.5% maximum. We are not dogmatic on whether that would be immediate or that would be a gradual approach. Of course, we agree with ISRI on excluding any obviously hazardous contaminants within that threshold. But we also think there's an important point about burden of proof on exporters and exporting countries, recognizing the challenges that customs face at the borders. And I think, as our colleague from ISRI just mentioned, industry specifications cannot be used instead of contamination limits to implement these amendments, because industry specifications often have a different aim, right? They are there to facilitate commercial transactions, and they may apply even for bales that do not meet B3011 qualities. And finally, you'll remember there were these two exemptions on Annex 9 that we didn't discuss in detail, 5 different fluorinated plastics as well as cured resins. Well, we had a look at these, and we've really found that not only are they very challenging to recycle if recyclable at all, but there are significant hazards that arise when they are mistreated, when they are mismanaged and open burned. Therefore, we recommend that they are treated in national legislation under Annex 2 or equivalent controls as Annex 2 until the Basel COP has the opportunity to deal with these issues there, because they will not satisfy the environmentally sound recycling requirement under B3011. So de facto, they contradict B3011. And I'll leave the upstream measures for the open discussion. And next slide, please. Next slide again. There we go. So to discuss further, you can access our briefing on the issue, but also a legal opinion by the Center for International Environmental Law that looks at the issue of Article 11 agreements within the Basel, and Basel obligations, and explains why we believe that those amendments apply for all parties of the Basel Convention, because we don't see at the moment valid Article 11 agreements happening that provide equivalent protection. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cyrine, and for keeping it also very brief. And yes, we have the reference here to those briefings, and I'm sure participants will be eager to go and take a look at them. So in the 10 to 15 minutes that's left, I know there's been a lot of information thrown at you. I'd like to invite questions from the floor. And